Okay, there we go. That's a little cool. All right. So yeah. So again, sorry. Welcome, and yeah, we're part of XRYS Solidarity. We're a campaign group of youth who fight for, create, and believe in a youth-led environmentalism for liberation. So we try to actively resist white supremacy, heteropatriarchal dominance, imperialism, speciesism, and all forms of oppression within the environmental movement and beyond. And importantly, working in solidarity with our partners. So we got in touch with our Global South partners in the first half of 2020 to ask what are the main challenges regarding the climate crisis that they face. And actually, to our surprise, conservation seemed to be the most urgent and common problem. So this is something that we've been looking and working on now for the best part of a year. And we've also just joined the campaign, like some of you may have come across this presentation through the WTFWWF campaign, which aims at bringing the messages of decolonising conservation right to the heart of the WWF, and then highlighting the issues there. But we'll touch more upon that throughout the whole presentation, and we'll tell you a bit more about the campaign a little later on. So yeah, just to frame this talk a little bit, we're not intellectuals, we're not academics. We've done this research as a youth group, and so we're not here to intellectualize this. It's not about having a debate, and so we really ask that we try to engage on it on a human level, bringing in sort of that emotional aspects, because otherwise we can get stuck up in our heads, and it doesn't really always motivate us to act. So plus, if we're here discussing the damage of colonialism, then we should not only engage with this, we should not only engage this in this very like white boy intellectual way. So yeah, as we go through things, just making sure we bring that emotion and that real connection to what we're hearing. But obviously, you may have some questions, so please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So yeah, if we just keep that in mind, try to keep our awareness on our body and our emotions as we are learning. Okay. So we have the following contents coming up. We're going to look at today's conservation approach, including fortress conservation. Then we're going to dig a little deeper into the history of how did we get there, and importantly, who's making the money, who's profiting out of this violence that we're going to tell you about. And then we're going to move into the indigenous and community-led conservation to really explore the amazing solutions and diverse opportunities that we have to really combat this very limited sense of conservation that we currently have. Yeah, and then we'll finish by just getting into what we're doing about this, and a little bit more about the campaign that I mentioned earlier. So before we begin, we're just gonna use a little Menti word cloud to explore the question of what words do we associate with conservation. So that the first sort of initial concepts and ideas that come into your head, or the feelings that you have around the idea of conservation as you know it now. Okay, so I'll just pop a little link in the chat, which should take you to a page where you can input a few words, and then we'll just take 5 minutes to do this, and then we'll have a look at what everyone has put. Just give me a shout if there's something wrong with the link. Okay, I'm just gonna share the screen. We can watch some of the different words coming through so far. So that's a big bold way to start it with white patriarchal. Someone's been doing their homework. So yeah, protected areas is a key thing for a lot of people. Biodiversity. Yeah, we have words like colonialism, and we'll definitely unpack that in this talk about the interconnection there. Preservation, conflict of interest. That's a very good way to put it. And we'll see a lot of conflict of interest coming up in later parts of the presentation around the corporate links. Take one more minute, just watch those different results coming through. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for everyone's input into there. We've got a good range of different things from NGOs are the wrong way, indigenous communities, and also the sort of broader principles of equality for all, care for the land. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I'll just pop us back onto the presentation if I can find it. There we go. Can everyone now see the slides again?
Yep.
Sweet. Okay. So here's just a little definition that we think sums up some of the aspects that are important to conservation. It's by someone called Sandbrook, and they sum it up as actions that are in conservations are actions that are intended to establish, improve, or maintain good relations with nature. So we find that this definition leaves open for a diversity of different relations and understandings, and you know, this is ultimately our goal. However, we really need to delve into what's the reality and what's actually happening on the ground, which we'll look at tonight. So I'm just going to share a video with you now, which is sort of like a step right inside to some of the lived experiences of conservation as it's going on now. And so when we watch this, just reminding people to be aware of what feelings this comes up, because this is a video of people's lived reality. It does contain potential triggering content or violence. And yeah, so I'll share the video and then I'll give you more of the context after. Now, this is a video shared to us by our partners at Survival International.
প্ৰশাসন সোমাই দিলে আপোনাৰ 1800 সোমাই দিয়াৰ পিছত 600 মানুহে আগভাটা দি পেলাই ৰখাব নোৱাৰি তাৰপিছত তাহাঁতে ডাইৰেক্ট গুলি অৰ্ডাৰ কৰিলে গুলি অৰ্ডাৰ স্পট ডেট দুজন মানুহ জেগাতে যেতিয়া ডেট হৈ গ'ল তাৰপিছত ৰাইজৰ ফালৰ পৰা কি উপায় নাই আৰু মানে অঞ্জমা গুলি খায় স্পট ক'ত গুলি লাগিছিলে তেওঁ বুকুত লাগিছিলে পুলিচৰ ফালৰ পৰা মানুহে কেতিয়াবা ক্ষমা খুজিছে নে এইটো কাৰণে নাই আজিলৈকে একো ক্ষমা খোজা নাই
Sorry about that. Random Facebook video. Can everybody see the slides again?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so what we just saw there, you know, might probably come as a bit of a shock to a lot of people. That video is set in what is today known as a Kaziranga National Park in Assam, India, and this was in 2016. So 2 people were killed and about 20 injured during this brutal eviction. The eviction of 3 villages carried out in the name of conservation involved 1,000 security personnel, along with elephants and bulldozers to destroy hundreds of houses, a government-built school and a mosque. So the families being evicted were from a non-tribal Muslim community, which had been established at the edge of the national park for decades. This area was due to be added as an extension to the park, and the Guwahati High Court ordered the eviction in October 2015, and they cited the needs of wildlife and stating there should be no human habitation. So we were very shocked to find out this was happening, but according to our partners, this model of conservation is one of their biggest threats across the world. So now I will pass you on to Verity, I believe, and she will take us through what is going on in today's conservation.
It's me, actually.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie. I'm going to walk you through what we know conservation is today. So most commonly, conservation has portrayed a model known as fortress conservation. A bit of a disclaimer, we're not here to criticize the principles around conservation and the need to preserve nature, but rather the model that is fortress conservation, which we will explore in this talk. The Western approach to conservation is basically sending heavily armed soldiers to communities to evict them from their land in order to protect nature. They fence off huge areas of biodiversity to protect them and keep anyone but the animals out of this big areas of land. And these protected areas are often funded by the EU and also the World Bank, and they use their money and their funds to equip eco guards in order for them to then be violent towards indigenous and local communities. However, according to major conservation organizations, local tribes are also considered poachers, who are in the way of conservation and preserving the environment. This model of conservation is very common in Africa and Asia. And as I said before, is called fortress conservation. It's called this because unauthorized people, hence locals and indigenous peoples, are kept out of the conservation zone by military level force creating a national park or extractivist zone. Just a reminder, fortress conservation justifies brutal evictions of tribal communities on the basis that any kind of human presence is a threat to the environment, as if like humans weren't involved in the evolutionary process of these spaces, except only if you're a wealthy tourist you can go to this place, which is really bad. Next slide, please. So what happens is that then we have the criminalization of indigenous and local communities and their way of life, because they are evicted, left homeless, and faced with abuse, because apparently their way of life is not legitimate. Indigenous peoples are routinely kicked out of parks and beaten when they exist. Their subside ways of life are criminalized and forbidden. The eco-guards and park rangers burn local people's homes, steal goods, beat, torture, rape, and kill local people with impunity. And this is done in the name of conservation. The WWF and other conservation agencies give weapons, vehicles, salaries, and equipment to these eco-guards that manage them. However, they avoid liability for their crimes by having them formally employed by the government. Next, we're going to watch a video sent to us by our partners documenting people's experiences of conservation violence within the Sengwer community at the hands of the Kenyan Forest Service, which collaborates with WWF within the Mbobut Forest in Kenya in 2017.
tangu Boris wa kuja wafukuze watu, tuliona shida mingi sana. Hata inga tulikuwa tunataka tutarajia tusome, hakuna mahali penye tutasomea kwa sababu wazazi walifukuza kondoo ikuje pande. Sasa wanyama wakakuja huku wakaanza kufa moja moja, inaanza kufa mpaka tukakufa moyo, hatukusoma tena. Wakati forest walichoma manyumba, tukaenda kulala kwa msitu. Hatukuwa tunajua mahali penye tutaenda tena. Sasa yangu mwenye alikuwa na mimba akashika hiyo mtoto, baada ya hiyo akasikia kifua, akapelekwa hospitali mpaka siku hiyo akakufa, akawacha mtoto mwenye ako na 9 months.
Chole fai tungono findikin somok kukonjini ga yere gule joche chire kasa chwere mtingane mting pindiki mi chi tungo pindiki ni wakara kandu mertoy mi chwere kire kasa asa akap ka bandalet ka ba jepte na ka tyo nyam na ku trin takre ni purnyina a cha wer ta mabel ji banoni bari tunoni ake pel ka tabuna ka gara kina Kibyoso yatine wala ritita tukun giritu ni ba kongu tiyat aglap ta jage bege amran sai pag ba yatera ga embasan den ma gup kote a kanya tibyoso ba nani mata ko so mesan jimbalawa kep kat kisi ta ba nyaw sanag la aso mesan nane ang non robi
Kimwa la kai ke bengo tibyoso.
Thank you, Johnny. Now let's take a moment to be aware how these videos and these images are making us feel, and just connect with your body and just acknowledge the violence. Let's acknowledge the violence that we've just seen. And for a split second, let's put ourselves in the shoes of those people who've had their whole lives taken from them. And we're now going to go into a 5-minute breakout room where we're going to discuss how this is made us feel. So I'm going to pop the questions in the chat and engage in a way that allows you to not intellectualize the situation and acknowledge the stories of these people and everything they live. Hi, Jay.
Yeah, it put you all into one room, didn't it?
Yeah.
I'm just moving you around now. Verity, I invited you to join a different room. I don't know if you got that.
Oh, got it.
Oh, yeah, chaos as well.
Hello. Is it Kay? Maybe you're away. Yay! Oh man.
Hello. Is Johnny gone?
I don't know. Oh,
Oh no.
he's back.
How do I bring everyone back?
I think I abandoned my group. I'm sorry.
Hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello.
Hello. What sort of things were people talking about in their groups?
in Bali.
So man, it may just take maybe another 30 seconds or so for everyone to come back in, but then you can go from there. I think we're still waiting maybe for 5 people or so.
I don't know about other people. I was on a little breakout room on my own, so I had some just time to contemplate. But I feel like when the little girl speaks about when her family was evicted and her sister was pregnant, that gets me every time. It just hurts that they were just living so peacefully and suddenly it was just destroyed and wasted, like such opportunities for people. And for her sister and her baby, it's just such a nasty thing to do.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for the patience with this sort of online platform. I think we're just gonna carry on with the workshop and the talk. So just reflecting back on like the brutalities that we've seen and the human rights abuses that people go through is just the tip of the iceberg to what's visible to us. Can I ask people to mute their microphones? I'm getting some noise coming back. Thank you so much. Because there's so much suffering that people go through when they're evicted from their lands. It sustains them emotionally, culturally, physically. It's really, really hard to see how devastating the impact in their socioeconomic rights, their livelihoods, and their survival. Most of these indigenous and local communities have for centuries relied on the land, the forest, the rivers to provide for all their basic needs. If they cannot hunt or gather food in the forest, nor grow crops, they risk starvation. If they cannot access the river anymore, they cannot find water to drink or wash themselves. When their houses are burnt or destroyed, they become homeless, which sometimes happens in the rainy season, leaving them very vulnerable to diseases. They lose their homes, their property, their land, their occupation, and their means of subsistence, leading many to live in abject poverty and even die of hunger and disease. They are often relocated in distant areas from schools and hospitals they crucially need. For example, we saw that visiting the Vaca communities evicted from the national parks in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Peter Kitelo from Kenya's Forest Indigenous Peoples Network told us that the Vaca now live in horrible conditions and have resorted to stealing to survive. That is what they are now doing. The evictions have taken their very dignity as people. The damage inflicted upon their culture by loss of land is also devastating. A lot of these communities, especially indigenous ones, their culture, spirituality, stories, and language are all deeply related to and embedded within the land. By losing their land, they lose their sacred sites, their sacred mountains, rivers, trees, and forests, and with them, the relationship with their spirits and gods. They lose their burial grounds and the relationship with their ancestors. These places are fundamental for their creation stories, their language, and their culture, which begin to erode and disappear when they're displaced. Essentially, they disappear as a culture and a population. It's a cultural genocide. They lose the places and the areas that they used to share as a community and where they did activities together. They forget their tradition, their language, and their identity. Not only this is a genocide for them, but it's also a disaster for humanity as a whole, because we all lose the precious cultures and perspectives that enable people to live in balance with ecosystems and not destroy them. As you can see from this report from the WWF, conservation organizations may externally claim that they have consent of indigenous people. And of course, they publicly deny these abuses or say that they have been solved. Yet internally, the reports say very different things. It may be useful to just take a moment and see how it feels to learn this about WWF, that after believing for so long that they did such good work, the truth is that they are knowingly covering up abuse. Not only abuse, but greenwashing and a lot of marketing. So yeah, this anonymous report, it wasn't anonymous. I think it was carried out by a UN, by someone from the UN who did a report on them. Next slide, please. As the map shows, this conservation violence is inflicted upon indigenous peoples across the world. These are just a few examples. This catastrophe has affected tens of millions of people. A study in the Journal of Conservation and Society estimated that the displacement due to conservation may be between 10 and 20 million people, but some estimates even a reach of 136 million displaced peoples. Whew. However, this conflict happens all over the world, and it is really sad to see that the communities who are more heavily impacted are those that are a bit more vulnerable. Yeah, next slide. Once a national park or wildlife reserve is established, the same groups who kicked out the locals then welcome thousands of other paying people into the land. Actually, many so-called protector areas encourage tourism, trophy hunting, or permit logging, mining, or other resource extraction. In fact, a former WWF employee just wrote a book showing that WWF lobbied against laws that would limit trophy hunting. Now we can look at how the government and WWF carved up Baka land, and they took it away from the community. So here we have a good representation of how this breakdown of land ends up in extractivism and greenwashing. And we can see that the trophy hunting zone is quite big, 150 square miles. The logging zone, 60 square miles. The National Park or Reserve is only 60 square miles. And the land that the Baka received was only, well, that was just really sad. In summary, the rich can access the land for tourism. The poor can no longer feed their families. The rich can hunt in the protected area zones. Indigenous hunters face arrest, beatings, and death. This is a big problem because we're seeing the monetization of conservation via tourism, trophy hunting, also logging, and possibly also oil extraction. This ecosystem is not simply preserved, is managed according to external capitalist imperatives. Only Western actors reap the benefits of the monetization of nature, along with many local elites and governments. But this doesn't help the hosting country nor the ecosystem at all. Nature is again exploited for profit, even when claiming to be protected. This colonial concept of protected areas is therefore a major contradiction. It is ineffective. It's an ineffective form of conservation, extractive and non-ecological activities. Even tourism is prioritized, whilst the guardians of the forest and the true carers of the ecosystems are being evicted. Here it is important to highlight that we are not against protected areas. We want to see truly protected areas where the local protectors are able to defend their lands against polluters and powers destroying these lands and livelihoods. Overall, cruelty, sorry, it's just, I get really, this energy, just by saying all this, it gets me quite emotional. Currently, everyone is losing because local people are suffering, and the climate, ecological and biodiversity crisis is getting worse because of this division of thinking that people don't belong in ecosystems, and by separating people from their ecosystems, we're actually doing more harm than good. Now I pass to the history.
Thanks, Mel. I will, yeah, just maybe everyone needs just a minute just to breathe and absorb that all a little bit. Because yeah, now we're gonna dig a little deeper back into the roots of this, the history of this. Got this great quote from Angela Davis that radical simply means grasping things at the root. And yeah, so I mean, what we've just heard from Mel is I mean, it's pretty shit, isn't it? To be honest. And so we need to really explore the crucial question of how did we get to this place. So yeah, we need to get a bit radical in our thinking by going below the surface and poking around the roots of fortress conservation and the movement as a whole. So we'll have like sort of three main frames to this historical sort of overview. It's far more complex, but you know, we have to try to fit everything into this presentation. So in a minute, we're going to walk through the story of Yellowstone National Park in the United States. This is widely considered as the birthplace of modern parks-based conservation, known as we've been exploring fortress conservation. But before then, we're going to just lay down some key foundation for what was going on at this moment of time around the back end of the 18th century and the ideas which were arising at the time. So yeah, as I said, there's three big frames which we'll explain over the next few slides. And these are colonial expansion, racism and eugenics, the human nature split, and mass industrialization. So these are like the big stories we want to highlight at the core of fortress conservation. And yeah, just a warning, it's not very pretty. So first up, we have colonial expansionism, racism, and eugenics. So conservation as we know it began to emerge by the late 1800s in response to and alongside the global colonial invasions. In particular was the invasion that created the United States and involved a huge genocide against the indigenous populations, including enslavement of African peoples and others, and that was just justified through stories of European superiority. Core to this was that white people, as God's people, had been given the divine right over the natural world, and then non-white people were classed as lesser, and often classed not even as humans, but simply as wild savages. So therefore, the taking of indigenous land, the genocide of its people, and slavery became not acts of violence from some humans to other humans, but simply white people as the only real humans stepping into their perceived destiny of rightful domination. So this view, which can be called eugenics, this wasn't a fringe view. It was all amongst leading figures of the early conservation movement, like Roosevelt pictured here, and Madison Grant. You know, this was core to their idea of the world, and therefore the practices they put into place. And this was a big part of the shaping of US conservation, which we will see in Yellowstone. Yeah, so with that, we'll move on to the next frame, which is the human nature split. So from this very overtly brutal sort of understanding, we now move into sort of the insidious broken heart of Western thought, which is the splitting of like human from nature and mind from body. So the word nature has been defined basically as everything that isn't human or made by humans. So in its very creation, we split humans away as something separate from the rest of reality. This is core to the Western ideas of self and has a long old history that we just don't have time to explore here. But we do need to talk about two men at the beginning who were very much involved in this thought around the beginning of the industrial age, who set the frame upon which the modern age began. So first we have René Descartes, who gave us the most loved phrase of disembodied white boys, which is, "I think, therefore I am." In effect, to be human was to think. And remembering that in René's world, only rich white dudes could think. And so the more insidious side, well, even more insidious side, that's already insidious in itself enough, was his beliefs that non-humans were therefore unable to think. They were just objects, you know, devoid of all sentience and effectively biological machines. The rather fucked up way of proving this was that he nailed up his wife's dog to try and convince her that this dog was simply a machine. And despite all of the seeming madness, somehow René's ideas stuck, and the natural world became not something sacred, but a machine for man to control, to manage, and to ultimately exploit for man's purpose. So, you know, think industrial animal farming, factory farms, and you've got the idea of where this is all led to. So into this particularly messed up situation steps Sir Francis Bacon, the one with the funky hat, and he's the so-called father of the scientific method, but also torturer of accused witches as Attorney General in his time. So we get an idea of what he was like. So what Bacon added to this human nature split was the reframing of the classic idea of Mother Earth as instead a harlot, which basically is an old school word for slut or prostitute. So yeah, you can really see the context of how this was also grounded in patriarchal violence as well. So a quote from Bacon: "Science should torture nature's secret out of her, giving the man the power to conquer and subdue, to shake her to her foundations." So yeah, we here again, we get a good sense of the sort of man and ideology we're dealing with. So from this fragile male ego and his need to dominate, and built this was the foundations of modern science was built, and it was built on this idea of increasing man's power to the point when he could conquer and subdue even Mother Earth herself, and in effect weaponizing centuries of patriarchal violence and insecurity as a driving force of Western thought. So putting these two together, the fact that I think, therefore I am, the reason to think and to pursue science, along with its violently conquering the natural world. And therefore we see it's what can come together out of this is the idea of that being a good human is dominating the natural world. Yeah, so again, we get the essence of the ideologies that are coming out and their particularly messed up views. But anyway, let's put this aside for now. We'll come back to it, but we're going to talk about industrialization at this time. So the 1800s saw the beginning of the real boom of US industrialization. And what drives industrialization? It's alongside people power and exploitation. It's new land to build on, and B, resources like wood, coal, metals, and more fuel to keep growing in a growing market. So in effect, it's everything that our first two frames provided: a destiny to expand across the continent and the drive to conquer nature. So we could all dive into this much deeper, but unfortunately this isn't the time. But the crucial piece here is that the US economy was utterly dependent on securing new land and exploiting new natural resources, these first two frames. And so also remembering that this also works so much better when you have the sense that you've got the divine right. And when you see the conquering the living world as a test of your masculinity, we can now dive into Yellowstone and the birth of fortress conservation and see how that manifested. So just for context, this is Yellowstone here in the United States. So what was Yellowstone before the white man turned up and named it that? It was actually home to over 20 groups of indigenous peoples, almost all of them seasonal visitors, though the Tukadika lived there year round. These groups would visit the park on their seasonal migrations, stopping for provisions, trading, and really importantly, ceremony. And so this was, really the old way, living with the environment, people embedded within the seasonal flows of the valley at Yellowstone. And, this has been going on for generation upon generation. So taking us up to the 1870s, this was where we begin the story of the national park. A time that began to see the first real advances of logging and mining into the territory. So on the back of increasing pressure for resource extraction, this saw the US government pass the Act of Declaration in 1872 and declare this area that they now named Yellowstone as the first national park in the US. This was primarily under the guise of protection from the extractivist invasions of the park. The park can be seen as a genuine attempt to preserve an incredibly beautiful space. However, by establishing the park as national land, the US began evicting indigenous groups from the land. This was mainly done in the name of encouraging tourism, and still this is directly mirrored in modern fortress conservation today. And it also shows the clear racism in who the people are that the park has been created for. So following the so-called Indian Wars, the US Army were then stationed as official stewards of the park, and Fort Yellowstone was constructed. And this obviously led to an immediate surge in the level of violence that was present and used to evict indigenous groups. This violent eviction of the land's peoples also began the process of erasure. So not only were they simply content with taking the land, but the stewards wanted to hide the violence from the tourists and reassure them of their safety. So stories were invented to suggest that the native people had never really visited the area of the park anyway. They were ultimately removed from the history of Yellowstone Park. These efforts combined effectively to rid Yellowstone of its original inhabitants and began to erase and twist any memory of their presence. And this was to create the idea of pristine wilderness, a concept that we're still familiar today in conservation, which is heavily promoted by groups like WWF. Okay, so when we go to looking at the promoting of the pristine. So when wild lands are taken and declared pristine, ultimately it's implying a meaning that they're in an original condition or unspoiled, which sounds like a piece of marketing really, and gives off some very strong Garden of Eden vibes. The idea of pristine wilderness, as defined in the Wilderness Act of 1964, is actually really deeply fucked, and I'll explain why. Ultimately, the Wilderness Act clearly defines wilderness as an area where the earth and her community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And this is such a way of saying only white people are human. It's a complete swipe declaring that all of those who lived there before in these so-called wildernesses, they did not shape them and so cannot be human. So it's complete overt racism and indigenous erasure. As Australian academic Heather Goodall explains, our assumptions about pristine wilderness are completely culture-bound. That is a construction of a settler society that we want to pretend that the original owners of the land no longer exist and never had an impact on the land, which is simply not true. So it also clearly frames humans' relationship with nature not as interconnected, as an interconnected one, but as only a negative one, defining all humans within this separationist colonial legacy and writing us off as spoilers of nature. So who wins in this situation? Why are these ideologies so supported? Well, as you may have guessed, the winners were really the logic of capitalism we briefly discussed above. Firstly, tourism in Yellowstone was booming, with 1964 seeing just shy of 2 million tourists visiting the park, offering escapes into the wildernesses from ever more chaotic life in the cities. But you might have the question, isn't this all still good that people get to experience the magic of the natural world? But here we really need to talk about how the creation of the pristine fundamentally alters our engagement with the rest of the natural world. It becomes something to be consumed. Instead of engendering a deep sense of interconnectedness and the sacred, it becomes like a theme park or something that we visit in a consumption base. And so also, you know, it then allows this attitude of, you know, don't worry about the fact that we're trashing the land near your house or destroying your local forest. Just save up and come to Yellowstone for the summer, and then you'll realize that your local area isn't that special anyway. And so, in effect, capitalism wins both sides of the fence. Inside, it turns human interaction with nature into a for-profit spectacle, in effect, more theme park than natural environment. And outside the fence, the saws continue to cut, the mines continue to plow and destroy into the earth. Yeah, so quite heavy stuff, and it only gets sadly worse because this model was then exported across the world. So by this point, hopefully we've helped connect some of these deep stories that underlie much of our modern world with the birth of Fortress Conservation Park model that Yellowstone represents, and which literally became known as the Yellowstone model that conservationists would then use around the world. But why did it spread across the world? Well, it became very popular for ruling colonial powers due to its colonial and capitalistic successes, namely being a highly effective means of social control and a model for supporting extraction outside of the park whilst making loads of money inside. Then in the post-independent years, many local elites simply took on the mantle of the colonial rulers, also finding the Yellowstone model a very effective means for controlling the problematic populations and marginalized communities, as well as upholding the goals of development that these elites were ultimately forced to play up to in order to be respected and join the so-called free world. And so, yeah, this brings us right up to the present moment where we are today. So just a little look at this sort of the updated white superiority complex in modern fortress conservation. And it's important that to look at how this model, with the recent focus on species extinction, and how that's been, you know, really turned into a marketing ploy and another consumptive tool, because how else would you convince you to, you know, buy so many cuddly toys? But of course, you know, protecting species that are in danger is highly important. But after seeing all of this history, it makes it feel like they simply added this missing element to the theme park come zoo without any of the underlying stories changing. In the words of Mordecai here on the screen, adding this European focus on species just added another lens for white conservationists to declare their superiority. A quote from him: "The current white paradigm is that African wildlife is in danger, and the problem is that African people don't love the animals like white people do." So with this all in mind, it's about time we focus squarely back on WWF and into the present, and let's see how the WWF approaches industry. But before we do that, perhaps I'll just invite everyone to take a 1-minute screen break, as that was quite a heavy content and heavy section. So yeah, just come back in at 3 past and we'll call you back. Okay, if everyone would like to return, and we'll continue with Verity, I believe.
Thank you so much. I'll just give another minute or so for people to come back. Okie dokie, I'll begin. Hi, my name's Verity. Thank you for sticking with us. It is a lot of content. It is quite heavy, but yeah, really good that you're here. So pleased. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about bringing it back, to modern day stuff with how does this all work with kind of what we're seeing projected from WWF and other conservation NGOs. So we've seen how harmful fortress conservation can be for the communities that live in these areas. But paradoxically, it also fails to protect the ecosystems themselves. So overall, really problematic, really not helpful. So a large part of this is because of industry and industry interests. So for example, the WWF's board members are also board members of some of the biggest polluting corporations. So you've got Shell, British Petroleum, mining companies, transport industry, finance industry. So essentially the same people who are directing these organizations are also the ones destroying the environment and not caring. And with these kind of people, it brings the same capitalist and market-based mentality and worldviews. And that is why you see fantastic marketing from WWF, because they all come in with this focus. Yeah, an example as well is Nature Conservancy, which is another large conservation NGO, have been known to drill for oil on their own nature reserves. Yeah, thank you, Johnny. So working with industry rather than against it, I've introduced that. So many corporate conservation NGOs get funding from extremely polluting industries. And because of this, they partner with them and make them look eco-friendly. And this means that WWF is claiming that it's making businesses like greener and how virtuous is that. But the changes are actually minuscule when you look at it. And I'm sure a lot of you are involved in climate activism, or at least aware of like the crisis we're in, and the fact that actually it is the big fat cats, the big polluters that are causing huge amounts of damage, and it's all just being allowed through with this kind of greenwashing. So an example is Coca-Cola is a big partner of WWF, and it is also one of the world's largest plastic polluters. Yeah. So WWF invests their own capital in polluting industries in order to get more money to do more conservation. And some aspects of what WWF do is like good conservation. They employ thousands of people. Some people do really good work. But as we've seen before in this slideshow, and as some of the things we've learned is just that they pump a lot of money into doing really awful work as well. So another route in and another kind of pressure on the kind of the way that these NGOs are working is the charitable foundations that fund a lot into conservation are also doing the same thing, where they're investing their own capital in largely polluting industries. And so you've got a lot of areas where interests are tied to industry, and a lot of people sat in influential positions who have different interests from just conserving areas and improving the natural environment. So yeah, creates a massive conflict of interest. So yeah, essentially it's conservation projects are happening alongside rather than against industrial expansion, which can't really work. So if we go to the slide, yes, thank you very much. So greenwashing. I'm going to tell you a story in a minute, but just start with, so instead of trying to stop these companies from destroying ecosystems, the partners of, they partner with industries and protect small areas, often next to industrial projects. And so this helps these big polluting companies gain legitimacy and look good while they do awful things. An example of this is in Campo Man and Mban de Jurem national parks in Cameroon. These two parks were created with financing from the Consortium of Oil and Gas, which is just a big group of oil and gas companies that kind of work together. And it was created alongside the Chad Cameroon Petroleum Development and Pipeline Project. So when the Chad Cameroon pipeline was initially proposed in the late 90s, the consortium faced opposition by civil society and legitimacy crisis due to its impacts, obviously, on the environment. The consortium decided as a result of this, they were unable to secure funding for the pipeline. And so they decided to overcome this by proposing they would fund the creation and operation of 2 new national parks, which always reminds me of that bit in Harry Potter where Dudley hasn't got enough presents, and then his parents suggest they'll get him 2 more this year, and then everyone's happy. So yeah, and they said that these 2 new national parks would offset the environmental degradation that this new pipeline would introduce. People were appeased, and everyone's minds were settled about the impacts of the pipeline project, and so financiers started pumping funding into it. And these 2 national parks still exist today. WWF and the Cameroon Ministry of Forestry and Wildlife co-manage the 2 parks, and they still to this day get financing from the Oil and Gas Consortium. This creates something called a biodiversity blind spot, where conservation and industry partnerships focus on protecting a small area but legitimate bigger pollution outside of it. So the greatest threat to biodiversity, being industrial activity, is ongoing, and conservation NGOs are able to ignore it or even legitimate it. So the environment is continually getting degraded. Yeah. There is an article that tells you more about this case in Cameroon, by the way, and so we'll pop that in the chat for some further reading. Lovely. So, how does this partnership with industry affect local communities? So when they're focusing on protecting areas only, conservation organizations turn against the local communities, as we've seen from the beginning of this slideshow. Yeah, because it's the only kind of thing they can actually manage after colluding with polluters. They don't really have a lot of place to go because they're getting all their funding and they want more funding. So they're going to just have to get rid of the local people and keep everyone appeased. An example of this is some of the WWF's work in the Mesok Deja Conservation Project in the Republic of Congo. Several abuses were reported, and the WWF actually funded logging and palm oil companies. The logging companies were cutting down parts of the same forest that they were conserving, and they were putting in logging roads, which became a primary avenue for poachers entering the park. The WWF did not oppose any of these activities, although they were reported, and instead used their funding to pay for eco guards to come and abuse the local baka, which was the community within this park. Yeah, so I'll stop talking now to give you guys some time to breathe and think. And yeah, so we're going to do a breakout room for 10 minutes just to discuss power dynamics. I'm going to put the questions in the chat. So we've seen how this conservation model harms communities and how its origins is tied to racism and colonialism, and how its partnership with industry ends up harming even the ecosystems it's meaning to protect. So yeah, the two questions are, oh, no worries. Thank you so much for coming. Why does colonial conservation only happen in certain areas? And what are the systems and power dynamics that cause conservation to be like this? So I'm going to pop them in the chat. And also, just for everyone, just a reminder, these don't have to be like hugely transformative, mind-blowing discussions. It's just to allow you guys to kind of process and chat to people and engage in the stuff we're talking about a bit more. There we go. Okay, just waiting for some people to pop back. Yeah, I think so. Picture always gives me chills. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good chat with people in the chat rooms. Always trying to go in there and just have a good chat with people, and then suddenly it's like 30 seconds. Yeah, so at this point, you may be feeling a little outraged, you might be feeling sad, you might be feeling a mixture of things, you might be feeling really numb, because that's sometimes just how we cope with things that we didn't really expect, and awful things. but yeah, just like recognize what you're feeling as we go through. Our aim is not to make you feel hopeless or to feel really upset about the situation, but we want to dive in now to the fact that really, really amazing solutions already exist. We just got to get behind them. So I think it's Melanie who's going to talk about what other options the world has with Indigenous and community-led conservation.
Here we go. Let's get this conversation going. So this section is going to be focusing around understanding the role of Indigenous and local communities around conservation and why is it so important to be centering their voices more and more as we go along, as they are the front facing, they're in the front line basically of all these catastrophes. Indigenous and community-led conservation is the alternative. I would say it is the way forward, as it was the way that it was working before, and the model of conservation that succeeded must be promoted. We just don't want to protect community rights against biodiversity protection, but protect biodiversity more effectively by centering local and indigenous communities in conservation and advancing their rights at the same time. This is a solution to the climate crisis that we're facing right now. Indigenous people are fundamental to the preservation of global ecosystems and therefore of life on Earth as we know it. In fact, Indigenous people protect 80% of global biodiversity while representing less than 5% of the world's population. Let that sink in. This is because Indigenous people know their ecosystems really well and base their economies, ecological, agricultural, pastoralism, fishing, and hunting on the health of their ecosystems. The deep knowledge they have of their ecosystems is embedded in their culture, in their norms, myths, and spirituality. They are the last barrier of defense against the loss of biodiversity and collapse of ecosystems. Many Indigenous and local communities around the world hold a variety of visions that differ from the Western conception of nature and human separation. They see themselves as intimately connected with the land, the forest, and the ecosystem. They understand that their well-being is completely interconnected with the land that they exist in. Instead of understanding ecosystems as natural resources or a surrounding environment, they see plants, animals as part of their family, as sacred beings, alive and full of spirits. Therefore, they treat them with care to promote their interconnected flourishing. We're just going to watch a little video.
Mi nombre es Leonor Salavata, somos arhuacos de la Sierra Nueva de Santa Marta. Los pueblos indígenas tenemos una cultura que reconoce que la tierra es la madre, que la tierra es mujer, que la tierra es la que sostiene a la humanidad. Es el elemento esencial para la supervivencia de la humanidad, no solamente de los pueblos indígenas. Si la tierra no se cuida, los seres humanos no vamos a permanecer. Y para nosotros lo vital es que ese concepto no solamente es una teoría, no es una retórica, realmente es una práctica, en donde yo creo que no solamente nos corresponde a los pueblos indígenas por cultura, yo creo que la humanidad debe cuidar la tierra y debe ser un principio, debe ser un derecho humano saber lo que significa la madre tierra y lo que tiene la naturaleza. Eso significa para nosotros nuestros territorios, nuestras tierras.
Thank you, Johnny.
privacy impacts, in particular on members of indigenous communities.
Okay, I think we can continue. Just understanding the context of how indigenous peoples live and perceive their lives in connection with the land allows us to understand why the dispossession of indigenous peoples from the land is a sincere tragedy to them. But it is also harmful for the ecosystem, as those who are removed are actually helping it thrive. And that's why we must support the rights of indigenous people if we want to preserve the ecosystem. Both are not separate things. So here we have an example of how indigenous peoples are embedded within this resistance. One of our partners, the Guarani in Brazil, that live in the state of Sao Paulo, have been dispossessed in the past from their ancestral lands. Before colonization, their community used to be communal, collective, and decentralized in their decision making. But when the Portuguese came to forcibly rule, they appointed a chief to control them. A group of young Guarani then decided that gradually they're going to introduce their more traditional participatory and communal system, injecting new political energy into the community as they saw that their voices were impactful and very important. Their connection with spirituality and rituals and gathering with faith and grounding themselves in their identity, they then decided that they were going to create an institution called the Jurupa Commission, linked with the different villages, assemblies for coordination and mobilization. They have created networks of allies and contacts, made studies proving that their ancestral claims, and eventually mobilized all the southern Guarani to peacefully occupy the central avenue of Sao Paulo and the state of government building, resisting police brutality, intimidation until the government backed down and granted their land back. Unfortunately, when they came back to the land, they then started a process of regeneration, because when they were dispossessed, their lands were turned into eucalyptus monocultures, which had severely impacted and degraded the soil. Then the Guarani teamed up with agroecologists from Sao Paulo, and combining traditional knowledge with agriculture and other ecological research, they started to reintroduce bees and traditional seeds and used soil restoration techniques in order to regenerate the soil. They planted part of the Atlantic forest with a diversity of local species, applied treatment with plant-based fertilizers, and created an agroforest, which preserved the ecosystems and biodiversity by cultivating a wide variety of plants and foods on ground, bush level, and tree level, where the interactions between the plants, the animals nourish, fertilize, and support each other. In doing so, they purified the air, the water sources, and soil, while also producing nutritious food for themselves. And this is a great example of how there is an intersection between land rights as a fundamental way of ensuring true and effective conservation, and that humans and ecosystems are compatible with each other. Here we have a young voice, Tiago Caray, that shared with us his philosophy and his relationship with the land. And he said, this land does not belong to them. It is them who belong to the land, as much as all the animals and the plants that share it with them. This is why they work so hard to make their ecosystems thrive. They seek to live on a beautiful land, but never to own it, never to be its lords, never to dominate it and exploit it. They want to enrich the land for all living beings, including us and future life, to flourish on it. Tiago was very strongly against Western underlying assumptions of hierarchy among beings. As in Jurupa, everything is connected and relying on everything else. So it doesn't make sense to have something superior. The human needs the insect to fertilize the soil so they can eat. How can they be superior to insects if they wouldn't live a year without them? For them, all beings are connected and equal, like brothers and sisters. It is fundamental to treat every being, all humans, animals, plants, insects, and even stones with respect, dignity, and care. It is essential for us to learn from this perspective so that we understand that also in Europe and in cities, we can live on the land in a way that respects and protects it. So moving on to some scientific evidence, we have seen a surge of a huge body of academics and scientific research that's catching up on indigenous knowledge and finding out the increasing evidence that when the land is managed by indigenous and local communities, the biodiversity, forest cover, soil health, and state of the ecosystem are more generally improved significantly compared to when it's managed in other ways. Here we have the Ecological Society of America found that the percentage of intact forest landscape is 9% in indigenous local lands, while 6.8% in other lands. Indigenous and local communities are not just better than companies and governments at preserving biodiversity, they're also better than conservation organizations themselves. A study in the forest ecology and management found that deforestation in community managed forest is 0.24 annual average, while in protected areas it's 1.47%. That is 6 times as much, which is a lot. Researchers from the University of British Columbia published another study in Environmental Science and Policy that found that in Brazil, Australia, Canada, areas managed by indigenous communities have higher biodiversity than protected areas like national parks and wildlife reserves. It is not only indigenous and local communities slow down deforestation and degradation, but they actually improve the state of the ecosystem. Conservation science shows that indigenous and local people are the best equipped to preserve their own forests and land in general. Therefore, when they are evicted from their forests and become vulnerable, the land becomes vulnerable to destruction by outsiders. For this reason, many scientific ecological bodies are now recommending to promote and protect the land rights of indigenous communities in order to preserve the ecosystem. Right now, we are facing an climate and ecological catastrophe, which conservation is failing to stop or even slow down. So doing conservation in a way that really protects ecosystems is fundamental to the survival of humanity as a whole. If conservationists support companies and persecute indigenous peoples, they will be complicit with absolute ecological collapse. If they support indigenous peoples and fight companies, we still have a hope of surviving and creating a better world. This is a very important side note to this whole context of decolonizing conservation, and it's just the dangers of romanticizing indigenous peoples and culture. It is important to emphasize that this is not about taking romanticized indigenous solutions and worldviews and transferring them around the world in an alternative conservation model. Neither this is about romanticizing an experience out there of a struggle and resistance in a far-off place. This would risk reinforcing the racist and colonial trope that portrays distant, primitive, local and indigenous peoples as part of nature, as opposed to progressive, urbanized societies who are separate. Ultimately, it is about ending the violence and the hegemonic dominant conservation currently imposed, which has divided humans from nature. Instead of learn from the diversity, localization, and interconnection of alternative land practices, knowledge, and resistances, to then actively and collectively apply these within our own environmental contexts and also give reparations about the harm that's been caused in the past, instead of inflicting more harm. We shouldn't exotize community-led conservation. Sometimes it works well, sometimes communities do destroy the environment, especially when they have been pressured to modernize and have lost connection with ecological traditions. So it's not enough just to leave the community to do everything. It's important to support them, especially those elements of those communities that are most ecological, into working with the rest of the community to improve their own ecological practices. Communities are not always inherently ecological, but there are usually some elements that are, and those that can be supported to share their practices with the rest of the community and figure out together how to do things in an ecological way that also supports their own livelihoods. The community-based approach is also fundamental, because whatever conservation is done, if the community leads it, then they themselves will change their attitudes and keep taking care of the land in the future, instead of relying on endless external reinforcers and lack of ownership of what's being done in their space. This is a sense of sustainable that it ensures independence and self-reliance. So kind of transferring the conversation back into this context of Europe, what would happen if you wanted to go and live off-grid within the UK's landscape? It's unfortunate that we have to say that, like, in the UK, you wouldn't be able to do that. Fundamentally, it's illegal to live with the land unless you own it in the UK. And so we must ask ourselves, have we grown so used to the fortress that the walls and guards are no longer needed? How does wrapping ourselves into the story and not distancing it to a fight over here or help us embody it? Well, let's look at how people are trying to reconnect here in Europe as well, and kind of bring back this movement to connect again. Many communities in Europe and in big cities have a strong relationship with their surrounding environments and work together to make their surrounding ecosystems flourish in a way that also provides for their own food security. We can also reconnect to our land and thrive with it. Here are a few examples. The Welsh notion of filthyr square, sorry, I'm not Welsh, I wouldn't know how to pronounce that, is being taught in loads of schools these days and speaks back to a traditional Welsh connection with land gained through childhood that represents deeply felt ties of familiarity, identification, and belonging to the land we grow up on. It embodies the lessons we learn from the land. This is backed by the reassurance of Welsh language speaking across the country, something that, while we cannot go into in depth here, we must all learn to see the way our language shapes and is shaped by our association with the land from which we arise and formulate our understandings around. More generally, urban community gardens are long-standing ways to reconnect with the land and with the surrounding community and reclaim spaces while providing nutritious and ecological food, as well as making good friends and having a good time outside. There is also a growing movement that seeks to reconnect with the land, regenerate it, and heal it. The rewilding movement, which often talks of rewilding the human animal alongside rewilding the more human world. These movements are rediscovering the symbiotic relationships that humans have with ecosystems and that are essential for our own mental health and general well-being. Here are some more examples based in the UK. The Clapton State creates biodiverse green spaces in the areas that really need it, like council estates where loads of people live in a nature-deprived way. And then they do these small community activities together in planting flowers or making green roofs. There's another project called the Manor Farm Project That happened when a local community in South London decided to take a mini nature hub for local children to learn in. Together, they cleaned their streets and the river so the community could enjoy the place as a green space. 4 generations from different heritage and cultures built this together with hardly any support from the government. It all came from the community and friends. So what's next? What we need to do is, how can we learn from these alternative forms of conservation? What are the lessons that we can take from this form of conservation? Local, grassroots, bottom up conservation is more effective than just top-down conservation and fortress conservation. I'm aware that I'm taking over Verity's part, so I'm gonna stop.
That's right. You can go ahead, it's fine. Yeah, no, but well introduced. So we've got a quote here from Mordecai, which is just, we must dismantle and discard the model of conservation developed in the West and funded by the West to conserve for the West. We need to do that, and just like what Melanie was saying, is we need to start connecting with our own environments and understanding the places we live, like what kind of things can grow here, recognizing our, like, the kind of flowers that are about, the trees, the heritage that is right beneath us, that you just kind of passes people by. We were gonna have a collective discussion. That would take us right till the end of the session, and I really want to tell you about one of our partner campaigns. So we're not gonna have it, but so we're gonna move to slide 50. So these are some takeaway actions that you can do in your personal life. So abolishing this paradigm formulated in the West that separates people from nature, just like what Johnny was saying. Try and go for walks, listen to the sounds, understand the plants and the seasons. And we can also listen and learn from Indigenous resistance and wisdom, and promote Indigenous voices, listen to speeches. And we can also recognise Indigenous land rights and their sovereignty over the land, and help fund Indigenous people's work, or defund colonial conservation organisations. And also just tell people about what you've learned today, just some things you picked up, and just help people recognise, because so many people don't want to be causing harm. Lots and lots of people fund organisations like WWF with no idea. So we just need to get the word out there. Moving on to, very exciting, what a slide. So What the Fuck WWF is a campaign that XRYS Soul, we've recently partnered with. It's a very fresh campaign, and basically is trying to mobilize people to recognize decolonizing conservation, and try and like collectively organize people to get behind this fight for better conservation, and outing all these big corporations that are ruining people's lives and degrading the environment. So here we go, lovely. So Chaos has just put on the chat a link to the website for What the Fuck WWF. There are a number of ways that you can take action with them. One is defunding WWF. One is to join their campaign network. So fill out a form and you'll get an email about ways about being kept in the loop, or if you're really keen, you can join their core group that do talks and figure out actions and things. You could simply follow and share. You've got all the links to the social media things there, so you can they put out loads and loads of great content and educational stuff. And you can also join the hundreds of people that were already signed on to the open letter that is calling for a number of demands on the WWF for things they need to change. All of that is in the link, so check it out, share it around. Yes, so so they're also holding a number of campaign workshops, so they'll be sent around in the follow-up email if you're interested, and it will have more information about how you could get involved if you want to. So slide 53, please. There we go. Lovely. Here we go. So lots of links there and a QR code you can scan. If you would like to be involved in XRYS Solidarity, drop us an email by the email you got there. Just take a picture of the screen and you can keep it. And you can join us on social media pages. And we've also got a WhatsApp chat where everyone who's come to these talks posts about stuff that they're interested in, things they've read. We post stuff as well. And we'll also keep you updated with our plans and the next workshops. So if you want anyone else to come to these workshops, you can find out from them. So you can bring this campaign to your local group as well by either getting them to sign up to the talks. Also keep an eye out for the talk part 2, which is more of an action-based talk. So it'll be about the What the Fuck WWF campaign itself as part of our collaboration, their strategy, their story, and also how to directly get involved in working for justice and transformation against fortress conservation. Slide 54. So there are a lot of links that will be sent out in the email as well. They're resource links just so that you can back up when you tell people about some things you've learned today. Shows that it's not in, what's that you say? There we go, just post them all in there. So you can just copy those or go to those. Yeah, piles and piles and piles. Oh yeah, just a reminder to send the email your email if you didn't sign up through Eventbrite, so that we have it and we can email you some of these things. Just to wrap up, it's been such an honor to talk to you guys about this topic that I feel and we all feel is hugely, hugely important, especially now. Thank you so much for sticking with us and being here. Go out and spread the word, take action, and maybe see you around.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. It's been amazing. If you want to just unmute yourselves, give a shout.
Thanks.
Thank you for organizing. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. So good to see everyone.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Team, do you want to stay?
Bye-bye. Eric, what did you think?
It was